Hello, welcome to this presentation on the Shroud of Turin. I am Chris Morris, the Director of Faith Formation at Holy Family Catholic Church in Orange, California. And I am thrilled to be able to talk to you about this topic. This is one of those things that has always enthralled me. I hope it does so for you. I think you're going to find it pretty informative. There's a lot to talk about, so I'm going to cover quite a bit of detail. So I'm going to break this into two parts, each about an hour long. This way, you have a little bit of a break and can take that break and let some of the information seep in before we get to the real exciting second half of the story. So anyway, let us begin in prayer in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, thank you so much for the Shroud, for giving us this wonderful tool to help us in our challenges of faith. And, again, it's only through your love of us, that unconditional love of us, that we exist. It's only through that unconditional love that we can be reconciled to you and become the beloved sons and daughters we're intended to be. And again, as a sign of that love, you've given us this great gift and allowed us to interact with it and learn about it and grow with it as a means of helping us overcome our doubts. And we thank you for that. We ask that you open our hearts and minds for this presentation, that you allow us to really see the shroud for what it is. And we ask this in your holy name. In the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So, I think based on that prayer, you're probably aware of where I stand on the shroud. So I do indeed believe that it is authentic, and you should know that going in. Okay, so like every other human, I'm sure that my presentation is going to be colored by my conclusions, and just want to have that up front. So the question is always, is this the burial cloth of Jesus Christ? Yes or no? Is it authentic, meaning whether or not it's the burial cloth of Christ? Is it indeed a burial cloth of someone from 2,000 years ago? Is that is indeed been brought into question? Is it a fraud? Is it a fake? Is it a medieval hoax? That's something that we are going to cover. And then we're going to do that by kind of going through the history of it, its theology that underlies it, and we're going to spend a great deal of time on the science and maybe have a little fun with this as well. But my hope is that at the end of this presentation, you'll be able to make an objective decision of your own. What is the shroud? Is it a fake? Is it authentic? Is it an authentic relic of a event that occurred 2,000 years ago? And if it is that authentic relic, could it indeed be the burial cloth of our Lord Jesus Christ? And hopefully you can make that decision, and hopefully you'll be able to share some of this information with others and help them make a similar decision. So we're going to actually talk about this, as I said, in two pieces, just because there's so much, okay? So in part one, we're going to talk about what the undisputed facts are about the shroud, because there are some things everyone agrees with, whether they are faithful Christians or agnostics or atheists, scientists or none. There are certain facts that are just undisputed. Then we're going to go back after we review those facts, which I think alone will mystify you. We're going to go back and just remind ourselves of what happened to Jesus Christ through his passion, death, and resurrection. What do we know from the gospel accounts of those events, and make sure that we have those solidly in our minds. Then I'm going to bring you through almost 2,000 years of shroud history and science. Okay, so kind of bring you up to speed into the late 20th century, at least in this first part, and what we have learned about where the shroud was, how it got from place to place, and what sort of scientific inquiries have been done over that period of time to try to better understand what the shroud is. And then I'm going to give you a spoiler alert, because there is some news here that was shocking, that was received in 1988. And shocking not in a good way for faithful Christians who really were convinced the shroud was the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. So I'm going to let you know that, yeah, there was some bad news in there. And then we're going to stop, because then I'm not going to give you what the spoiler is. And then we will go to part two. And we're going to then dig into that spoiler, that issue. And we're going to dig in by studying the detailed scientific investigations that were done in the 1970s and concluded with the carbon-14 dating in 1988. Then we're going to talk about what's happened since 1988. What new revelations, and I'm using that scientifically, so scientific revelations have come to light. What new facts have come to light since 1988? And then we're going to talk about, what would it have taken? If those people that subscribe to the theory that this is a medieval forgery, if those people are true, what would have been required in order for them to believe that, or to actually make this a forgery? And then I'm going to give you a hypothesis about the image, which is actually a little bit more than a hypothesis now. I should probably update this. This is the prevailing theory of how the image that appears on the shroud was created. And you may be thinking, why is that a big deal? I think as we go through this, you're going to understand that a photonegative three-dimensional image of a human being somehow imprinted on a linen cloth made of flax is not something that is usual. As a matter of fact, this is the only known image of its type in existence. So understanding how that image was created is really a key to a lot of the Shroud investigation. Now I'm going to offer you my opinion, okay, which I think you kind of generally know what direction I'll go in, but I'll be a little bit more specific there. And then we're going to end just by talking about, what does this mean for our faith? What does the Shroud being real or not mean to our faith? And I think it's important that we end on that note and move from there. So hopefully you'll enjoy this. I will take a break. I'll stop the recording about halfway through as we move from part one to part two. And I would suggest that you stop as well and take a break, because there's a lot to absorb here. Again, you're free to watch it all the way through to the end. But I do think that when people get to see it in its two pieces, with a little bit of time in between to absorb the content, it's something that gets much more well ingrained into your memory. So let us begin without further ado. So what is the Shroud? Okay, so these are the undisputed facts, and you're going to see imagery. As a matter of fact, I want to go back one. You're going to see imagery of the Shroud throughout this presentation. So what you're seeing on the screen here is the Shroud and how it looks when you view it in real life. As a matter of fact, that bottom image, that very light image at the bottom, that bottom rectangle, if you were to go and be face to face with the Shroud today in Turin, Italy, that's what you would see. So you realize that when you're looking at the Shroud, if you look very closely, you can see the image of the man on that Shroud, but it is very light, not as defined as you would normally see, for example, in that top image, which is a photo negative of that. So it's a photo negative picture of the actual Shroud. And it's one of the things that makes the Shroud so interesting, because a photo negative picture, which you're going to find out later was created by accident, ended up revealing so much more detail about the Shroud. And then modern optical technology and photographic technology has revealed even more. So you're seeing three different images of the Shroud as it gets into greater and greater contrast. Obviously, that bottom image is what it would look like in real life to you. And those top two images are pictures of the Shroud that have been adjusted so that the contrast is higher and higher to bring out the details of the image that appear on that cloth. Okay? In this particular version of that image, you are seeing, so on the left-hand side of the screen, is the most high contrast photo negative image of the Shroud. And you can see there's a great deal of detail here, including blood stains and the marks of where the blood were seeping down this man's head from where he was impaled and things of that nature. So again, you're going to see a lot of imagery here. I try to explain them where it's relevant. Some I may miss. You're always free to drop me a line, ask me a question, and be glad to give you some more insight. So what are the undisputed facts? Number one, this cloth, okay, is one of the most analyzed ancient artifacts in the history of the world. More people have studied this. So when I say people, I mean scientists, historians, amateurs, professionals, than any other ancient artifact because it is so unique. It is truly a one of a kind. It is very large. It is over 14 feet long and over 3 feet wide. It's a living cloth. It's made with threads and a weaving pattern that's consistent with what you would have seen in first century Palestine. And by the way, it even includes weave faults that we would normally see there. So it's one way of dating specifically cloths or any sort of fabrics is you can look at the weave faults because weaving technology has changed over the course of the centuries, obviously. And by looking at the weave faults that were in place in a given cloth, you can tell what type of loom and equipment it was weaved on, and that will give you a really good indication of the date. Now, it doesn't mean that someone couldn't have taken an antique loom and weaved a cloth, years after the fact, but it is just one of the indicators that, yes, at least we know what the size of this cloth is and that it indeed was produced on a device that would have been consistent with what would have been used in the first century. It contains this amazing image of a man somewhere between the height of 5'10" and 5'11", who has been beaten, scourged, crucified, speared in the chest, and impaled with a crown of thorns. So if you know anything about the gospel accounts of Jesus's passion, you realize that this is what happened to him, that he was not just crucified as was typical in the Roman Empire, but he sustained a pretty significant line of torture before he was crucified, and some humiliating side actions like the crown of thorns during that torture and throughout his crucifixion. That this body seems to match perfectly. Okay, so the image of this body. So again, that is something no one disputes. The injuries, quite frankly, are really illustrative of how much our knowledge has grown over time. So in typical images of Jesus, you see him wearing a crown of thorns that looks like a thin strip, a round strip, which is typically how we view the crowns of kings and queens. But as it turns out, thank you to archaeology, we now know that that's not what a crown would have looked like in the first century. In the first century, a crown would have been more like a skull cap, something that covered your entire head. And interestingly enough, the wounds on this image do indeed cover the entire head. So, someone who was faking this, for example, would have had to know that. And every image you see of Jesus doesn't show him wearing a skull cap of thorns, or the vast majority of them don't. So this would have been something that, in order to forge this, in order to fake this, you would have had to have some knowledge that archaeologists, quite frankly, only discovered in the last century or so. So pretty impressive from that perspective. The wounds that appear on the shoulder. So beautiful thing with high definition imagery is we're now able to get some really detailed drill downs into the image that appears on the cloth. And now we know that there are wounds on the shoulder, which are consistent with something heavy rubbing on this person's shoulder for an extended period of time. So perhaps a cross that he was carrying, or at least the one of the beams of the cross, or it could have been the cross beam itself, was something that was rubbing across his shoulder. And we see that wound in the high definition images of this particular picture on the shroud. When we look at the blood stains that appear on the shroud, and there are indeed blood stains, and we'll get more into that a little bit later, those stains, the drip patterns, definitely indicate that this individual was still bleeding while they were in a vertical position. So they were dying in a vertical position. They were not dying laying down. And they died laying down. The blood stains and the splatters would not have moved in the pattern which we see on the shroud. Okay, so again, that just kind of correlates to the fact that this person was dying in a vertical position. The blood stains match Christ's wounds, so they're exactly where we think they would have been. The blood has been typed. So the blood on the shroud has been typed to be type AB, which is unique because that is a very rare blood type that you're going to find primarily from men and women who lived in the Middle East, okay? Which just kind of further says, yes, this was someone of Middle Eastern descent. Containing male DNA, so certainly a male, and a great deal of a hormone or pigment that your body releases when it's undergoing severe trauma. So we see it in torture victims, we see it in people that underwent like catastrophic events, such as a very terrible car accident or building collapse, things of that nature. Your body tends to release this chemical under this kind of pain and suffering, and we see quite a bit of that in this blood. And the blood stains themselves, they match a pattern that, at least the facial blood stains, match a pattern that we see on something called the Sudarium of Oviedo. And I'm butchering that name, and I'm terrible at even pronouncing English, much less words that are related to other languages and countries. But we know that the Sudarium is something that we have provenance to going back to the 6th century. So we know that because of the correspondence of the bloodstains that the Sudarium and the shroud both came into physical contact with the same human being who was bleeding at the same time. And the Sudarium has long been believed to be the face cloth of Jesus, the face cloth that's mentioned in the Gospels. And we have providence of that going back to the 6th century. So we know right from that correspondence, and it's really a unique correspondence, that at the very least the shroud must have existed in the 6th century. So if you think it's a fake, you can't think it's a medieval fake. Okay, you have to think it's long before the medieval period because we have this great correspondence. The shroud also contains, and this is another thing that science has really advanced, pollen samples that have embedded themselves into the linen fabric from all of the places that the shroud was thought to have traveled, moving from Jerusalem through Edessa to Constantinople, France, and eventually Italy. And they're in the concentrations that we would have expected for the approximate times that we think that the shroud was in these locations. So pollen dating and pollen tracking is a relatively new technology that emerged in the 20th century, but it is amazing, has given us great insights into where artifacts have been located through their history. In the vast majority, you're going to find one concentration of pollen because artifacts tend to stay in one place. But the shroud did not. The shroud moved, and interesting enough, the pollen analysis gives us an indication, or actually helps to reinforce what some of the prevailing theories are on the shroud's movement. There's dirt on the cloth, and it's in the knee area where this individual clearly must have fallen to their knees at one point. We see it on the knee, the nose, the heel, and strangely enough, this particular dirt is a rare limestone that is only found in and around the city of Jerusalem. So now we're getting much finer. We know that it's Middle Eastern. We know that it's 1st century. Now we're saying, hey, this was Jerusalem. We know it bears all of the indicators of Christ's crucifixion. We know that the blood is of a Middle Eastern man. We know so much just from the science that has been done. Again, this is undisputed. No one questions any of what I'm telling you now. So even the people that think it's a forgery have to admit, yeah, all this is true. Okay, so you need to lock that into your mind. Everything I'm telling you right now is what is not in dispute. These are accepted facts. Atheist, religious, makes no difference. Starts getting crazier. High definition digital imagery done in the late 20th century reveals that the eyes, which were thought to have been, they look very dark. They almost look like black holes on the image. But the eyes, as it turns out, were covered by 2 coins, okay? And these coins were rare. Matter of fact, we didn't even know they existed until some were found in an archaeological dig in the 20th century. But they are a rare coin minted by Pontius Pilate himself in AD 29. So it just so happens that Pontius Pilate, who was said to have allowed Jesus to be crucified. He actually shows up in the shroud image through the coins that were minted in his name. And again, these are very rare. People didn't even know they existed into the 20th century, and hence high definition imagery of them, showing them on the eyes of the individual in the shroud, is just an amazing little fact. We know that the image was not formed by paint, dyes, chemicals, vapors, scorching. As a matter of fact, we know it was not made by any currently known method of printing. So a printing method that may have existed 1,000 years ago, or a printing method that exists today, whatever it is, everyone agrees we have no idea how this image got on that cloth. Now, we had a hypothesis, which I'm going to tell you later, has actually become pretty much the prevailing theory. And tests have been run to say, could this actually work? And we think that the indications have all come back yes. All right. So when you hear that theory, I think you're going to be slightly amazed. But what we do know is this wasn't the work of an artist. There's something highly unusual happened that allowed this image to form. I'll leave it at there for now. The image is anatomically perfect. So, biologists, medical professionals have studied the image of this body, and they're like, yeah, this is a anatomically perfect human, and this is exactly what it would look like. We know that the image was formed after the blood congealed, okay, because there's no image below the blood. So that's an interesting fact. Somehow this bleeding body was on this cloth. Okay, I want you to think through this one carefully. Was on this cloth so that the blood stains could be formed. Yet the image wasn't there yet. So it wasn't as if, you would have had to put the body on the cloth, let the blood stain seep in, then take the body off and create the image. So this is an interesting little fact, which adds to the mystery of how this image was created. And again, we are very confident now that this is a three-dimensional image, and it's concurrent with how someone would have been buried in the first century. If you see in this image on the left, they're kind of imitating it. A man is laying down on a piece of the cloth, and then the rest of the cloth is wrapped over the top of him, and then the cloth is tied at certain sections across the body. And this was how people were buried. They were, laid on the cloth. It was folded in half over the top of them and tied together. And that, again, is exactly what we see in this image. And again, here's another interesting thing, which just leads to more of the mystery of the image. So normally when you create an image, say with paint or dyes or whatever, that paint or dye is going to seep all the way through the medium that's being used to contain it. So in this case, a linen cloth, but it could be a canvas, could be whatever. But we don't understand why in this particular case, the image only penetrates the uppermost fibers of the cloth. So we have no technology that can do that today. So we don't understand how this happened, okay? And again, this is one of the areas where scientists really get excited to study it. Whether they believe in Jesus Christ or not is irrelevant. They want to know, where did this image come from and how did it get on this cloth? And there's so many little interesting tidbits to it. All right. So those are the undisputed facts. I want that to sink into you for a second. These aren't things I'm presenting that, oh, that's Catholic propaganda. No, this is what everyone agrees to. People that question or debunk the shroud, people that believe in the shroud, they all agree with the facts I just presented. Okay, there is nothing there that is controversial whatsoever. So already, just on what we agree on, you have an amazing and abundance of evidence that points to, yes, this being the burial cloth, at least of a man who was crucified very much as Jesus Christ was, which we understand to be a very unusual crucifixion because of the events that preceded it. In the first century, in and around Jerusalem, just when Christ would have been crucified. So at the very least, that is what people agree to. So let's go back and look at that crucifixion. So Jesus is arrested and brought before the Sanhedrin. And during the course of this, and you can read about this in both the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Matthew, which I reference here on the screen, he is beaten and spit upon and tortured a little bit and manhandled. Certainly something that was pretty brutal. Okay, so this wasn't like they arrested him and put him in a cell and then they brought him out to be crucified. No, there was a lot of fun and games being had with Jesus long before he got to the point of the crucifixion. He's condemned by Pilate, and prior to that condemnation, Pilate tries to come up with a way that he really does want to release Jesus. And he says, well, maybe if I just, beat him severely and people will see that and they'll agree to his release. So he's scourged. And we read about that in the Gospel of Matthew, for example. And he's not scourged. And, a lot of people, we hear the word scourging and we're thinking whipping. This is not a whipping, okay? The image in the lower right is what a Roman scourge would look like. So it's a wooden handle with multiple cords attached to it. And in those cords, there's metal and bones and rocks, so that when the scourge hits you, it sticks into your skin. And when it's pulled back, it rips the flesh right off your body. So the image that you're seeing above this is from The Passion of the Christ, the Mel Gibson movie. Very graphic, but apparently one of the best illustrations of what it would look like to have been scourged. So you can see this is just a brutal beating with a high amount of blood loss. As a matter of fact, someone that would have been scourged as many times as the image on the shroud give us an indication he was scourged, certainly was going to die no matter what, whether they got crucified or not. The blood loss would have been enough to have killed them. So, after the scourging, it's very likely Christ was already on a path, irreversible path to death, long before they nailed him to a cross, which may also explain why he died so quickly on the cross, because normally those that were crucified could actually last quite some time, days, in fact. But Jesus lasted just several hours, and most would point to the fact that before he even got to the cross, he was basically a dead man walking. Then we learn that the crown of thorns is placed on his head. And again, this isn't a ringlet. This is a skull cap, and it's placed on his head. These are thorns. There's very specific thorns that grow in and around Jerusalem. They can be, 1.5 to 3 inches in length. So this isn't like little thorns on a rose bush at home, which are painful enough. These would have been very significant, lengthy thorns that they would have then impaled onto his head. And this image of them doing it with wooden sticks is a pretty accurate representation of what it would have taken to do this. So again, another brutal torture, would have been incredibly painful. And the fact that he continued to wear that crown through carrying the cross and being crucified and having his head bang against something with that crown on him over and over again would have just been excruciating pain that he would have relived again and again and again. So we know about the crown of thorns, and then we know he's asked to carry his own instrument of his ultimate death, his cross, whether it be the entire cross, the vertical beam, and the horizontal, or it could have just been the horizontal. We're not going to know for sure because Romans crucified people a number of different ways. But it wasn't uncommon for them just to carry the horizontal beam, and the vertical beam would already have been in place at the point of crucifixion, and then they just raise the horizontal beam up onto the vertical and attach it. But we do know he was crucified. We know that through that account, he does stumble and fall, which would point to the dirt that we see on the image. And we also know he's crucified between two criminals, one on his left, excuse me, oh, I apologize for that, and one on his right. So we read about that in John. And I would encourage you to go back and read these gospel passages. As brutal as they are, sometimes we hear them and we don't really think about them. I would really encourage you to read them and meditate on them a little bit and really try to put yourself in Christ's shoes. Try to experience what he would have been experiencing through these beatings and torture and ultimately his crucifixion. And then, as the day is ending, it happens to be Friday. Okay, so at 5 p.m., when the sun goes down, it would have been the Jewish Sabbath. And so the Jewish leaders said, hey, look, we don't want these guys hanging up on the Sabbath. Can you put an end to this now? And what that meant was, can you kill them now? Let's not wait for crucifixion to kill them. And this wasn't that unusual a request if there was high holidays or a reason to get the bodies off the crosses. they would do this. Okay, more often than not, they'd like to leave the bodies up indefinitely because they're a reminder not to do things you shouldn't do. But in the case of Jesus and his the criminal that was crucified with him on his right and on his left, they were like, sure, let's take him down. We get it. It's a high holy day coming up. So they did what they would typically do to the two criminals. They broke their legs. And in breaking their legs, they're no longer able to support themselves, which means now they're stretched out on the cross to a point where their breathing would be constricted, and basically they suffocate to death. So truly brutal. You've been hanging on a cross for hours, and then they break your legs so that you suffocate to death, and it doesn't happen instantly. So lots of pain there, and a terrible way to go. But when they come to Jesus, they find he's already dead, or at least appears to be dead. So to make sure, instead of breaking his legs, they actually spear him in his right side. And that's where we read about the blood and the water flowing out. So another unusual marker with Jesus, and we see the image of that spear mark on this body on the shroud. So again, another tie to something that would have been unusual and specific to Jesus's crucifixion that again appears on the image of the shroud. And then we hear about how Jesus is buried, and they wrapped him in a linen cloth, and you can see another image of that in the lower right. Again, the cloth is laid down, the body is placed on the cloth, and then the cloth is wrapped over the top, and then tied at different places along the body to hold it together. So that was the typical method. And then we hear about the empty tomb. Now, this is just an amazing, amazing tale. We hear this in the Gospel of John, but there's the resurrection accounts in all four Gospels. They all differ slightly, by the way, on who was there, exactly what happened, but not in any material way. So a lot of people get hung up on those differences. Quite frankly, most people in the know who are experienced in eyewitness accounts recognize that anytime you get a group of people that are recalling an event, they all will have slightly different versions of that event. All right, this is a technique that police often use, or law enforcement often use, to determine if there's a collaboration amongst the witnesses. Because if the witnesses all give the same exact story, you can almost know for a fact that they collaborated and worked on their story together before they gave it. And it's a sure sign of some sort of conspiratorial action there. But in the John account, we hear that Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb. She's there to anoint the body. The body had to be taken down in a rush at the end of the day on Friday before the Sabbath. So they didn't have time to do the normal preparation, the cleaning of the body, the anointing of oil with spices. So Mary and other women were going to the tomb, is what we understand from the combined accounts, to do this. And when they get there, we find that the stone has been gone. They're removed from the tomb. So the tomb is now wide open. Mary realizes, wait a second, there's no body in here. So she runs back to the apostles and says, hey, we got a problem. She speaks with Peter and John. And Peter and John, they go to the tomb, running to the tomb. Now, John would have been a very young man. So in case you're not aware of this, while Peter was likely a man in his early to mid 30s, John would have been likely a teenager, could be a late teenager, 16, 17, 18. So they're running to the tomb, and I think you can imagine if you have a young buck running with a middle-aged man, and that would have been middle age for Peter in that age, the young guy is going to win, and that's exactly what we see. Okay. And so John gets there first, and he looks in and he sees the linen wrappings, but he doesn't go in. He's waiting for Peter, the leader of the apostles. So Peter finally catches up, and he goes right in, and he saw the linen wrappings there too, and he saw the face cloth, not lying with the rest of the wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. And that's when John comes in. He then sees the linen wrappings of the body, and then the face cloth, again, that Sudarium of Oviedo that I mentioned earlier, rolled up in a separate place. And it's an interesting line at the end of that gospel passage. So the other disciple, this would be John, who had first come to the tomb, then also entered, and he saw and believed. And we kind of go through that pretty quickly when this gospel is proclaimed in Mass, so we don't really think about it. But think about what this is actually saying. It's John enters the tomb. sees the burial wrappings and the face cloth and believes. So something he saw in those cloths made him believe that Jesus Christ had rose from the dead. All right. It wasn't as if, because by the way, if someone had stolen the body, they could have removed the cloths and stolen the body. Who knows? But something John saw. And the question is, what did he see? Did he see the image, and be like, oh my goodness, how does this get on a linen cloth? Photography was years away, and we now know this isn't a photographic image. It's a photographic negative, but we don't know how it got on there. You don't take images with linen cloths. Could it have been the way that the face wrapping was rolled up? This is actually an interesting theory. Leaders and important people and rabbis, teachers, if they were dining with their students or those people that reported to them or worked for them, they would often have a special way of folding their napkin, their dinner cloth, and placing it at their place when they got up to perhaps go to the restroom or something of that nature, just to indicate, wait, this is Joe Schmo sitting here. So it would be some way that everyone would recognize, oh, that's the way that he or she wrapped it. And perhaps that's what John saw the face cloth wrapped up in a very specific way that only Jesus would do, and then put two and two together and said, wait a second, in order for him to have wrapped that cloth, he would have had to have been alive. So he was dead, and now he's alive. So maybe it was the image, maybe it was the face cloth, maybe it was the combination of the two. Okay, we won't know for sure. But again, want to make sure you understand the whole story and understand that very important piece. Let me take a sip of water and we'll move into history. So Shroud history. Wow, crazy times, okay? So where does it come from? Well, for a long time, people thought that the first time the Shroud showed up was in a place called Liry, France, in the 14th century, in the year 1355, in a church that was built by a gentleman named Geoffrey de Charnay, who happened to be a French knight. He happened to be a Templar knight. And when it was displayed, his granddaughter, Marguerite, said, yeah, this was something that Geoffrey bought back from the war. Okay, well, the war she was referencing was one of the Crusades. As a matter of fact, it's one of the most notorious Crusades, where the city of Constantinople was sacked by another Christian army. So Constantinople was the largest Christian city in the world, and this Christian crusading army attacked it and sacked it and stole most of its valuables. So not a shining moment in the world of Christianity and Catholicism, but it did indeed happen. So, Marguerite says, yes, this was one of those spoils of war. But the question is, where did it come from? If this was the burial cloth of Jesus, where was it for the 1300 years before this? How did this just pop up? And how come no one knew about it? So they start putting it on display in Liry, France as the burial cloth of Jesus. But right away you had skeptics saying, wait a second, where'd you get this thing? And where's it been for the last millennium and 300 years? Okay, so the last 1300 years. So that's where we really need to go through. And so we need to track its travels. So let's go, AD 33. Let's assume that Christ was crucified in AD 33. That is actually in dispute because we actually believe the year Christ was born was miscalculated now, and that he was actually born a couple of years BC, not on year 0. And hence 33 may not be correct either, but somewhere in that range. So let's start from there to the middle of the 6th century, to the middle of the 500s. And there is this great tradition, and I'm not going to tell you it's historical fact. I am going to tell you it's an ancient tradition that there's a city in Turkey called Edessa. It doesn't exist as Edessa today. It has a new name. Method, you see it in the note at the bottom, Senlirfia or Lurfa. I'm going to mess that up, so I'm not even going to try to say that again. But there's this tradition that the city of Edessa was a blessed city. And the reason for its blessedness, the reason it was seemed to be protected by God, was tied to something called the Akbar letters, which Akbar was a line of kings that were the rulers of this great city of Edessa. It was a great city in its age. And there was this legend that there had been letters written between Jesus and the first Akbar king. And there were later legends that as part of these letters, Jesus promised to either come or send a representative of his to the king. The king was looking for some healing. And, part of the ongoing portion of that legend is that after the crucifixion, indeed, one of the apostles, Thaddeus, also known as Judas, not Judas Iscariot, but the good Judas, who wrote the letter of Jude that appears in the New Testament. His name was also Thaddeus, sometimes called Adai. Okay. Now, that was not an uncommon name, so it could have been that particular apostle. It could have also been one of the 70 that Jesus had sent out. But we do have this legend that one of Jesus's representatives does indeed come to visit King Akbar. And you have this idea of when he came to visit him, he brought the king something. And in the image on the left, this is a piece of artwork, that ancient artwork that was found in a Turkish monastery, where it appears that the king is receiving this very long cloth from Thaddeus, and on the cloth is this face of a man. Okay. So again, you have this artwork, which is very interesting. Like, what are they trying to portray here? And some would say this would be an indication that it was indeed the shroud that this Thaddeus brought to the Akbar king. And the question is why? Why would he bring him the shroud? And the answer that's been put forward is a pretty viable one. Edessa was the largest fortified Christian city in the world. All right, so you have to remember that for the first several centuries of Christianity, Christianity was illegal in the Roman Empire and Christians were subjected to on and off again persecutions, and sometimes being put to death. So religious relics, elements that were tied to the earliest pieces of Christianity, were highly protected. And where better to protect this particular relic, the burial cloth of Jesus, than in the most highly fortified Christian city on the planet, which at the time would have been Edessa. So it is feasible that this wasn't just brought to King Akbar because Jesus had made some promises in letters that we do not have the originals of, but that it was done to actually, preserve this great artifact. So again, there's a lot of theory there, a lot of legend. Now, these legends have persisted for almost 2,000 years, so it's not as if they're unfounded, but the reality is, do we have a lot of verified multiple source historical proof of this? We do not. Okay. As a matter of fact, even though we now have the Akbar letters we have were told to be recreations of the originals. The originals were lost in a catastrophic flood that hit Edessa that we actually have archaeological evidence for. So they said they recreated them, but that was multiple centuries later. So again, historically, we can say this is a wonderful legend, a pious tradition, but we can't say for a fact that any of this occurred. I just want to make sure we're clear on that. But it is an interesting theory on how the shroud would have made its first move from Jerusalem to Edessa. And strangely enough, going back to that pollen evidence, we have a large concentration of pollen from in and around Jerusalem, and another large concentration of pollen on the shroud from in and around Edessa. So it does seem to indicate that, yes, it did spend some time in Edessa, and this legend seems to correlate to that. Now, what ends up happening is we had this catastrophic flood, and the Akbar letters are lost. And also this other thing that the folks in Edessa often talked about, called the image of Edessa. So that previous artwork was found in one Turkish monastery. In another Turkish monastery, we find this artwork where we see the image of Jesus appearing on a cloth again. And this was often thought of as the image of Edessa. And what is this thing? Is this the shroud folded up? Is it the the face cloth, the sudarium of Oviedo? Wow, my brain is not functioning. But anyway, following the floods that occurred in the early 6th century, as they were restoring the city, they were working on the city gate, and they accidentally broke into a secret compartment that is above and behind the city gate. And when they look in there, they see a jar, and in the jar they find what they then said was the image of Edessa rolled up. So some sort of cloth with this face print of Jesus on it rolled up was stored in this jar, and was actually, because it was stored at the top of the gate in this jar, was preserved from the flood damage. So sort of a miraculous saving of this image of Edessa. And really from that period on, once they rediscovered the image, a strange thing happened. Up until then, Edessa, its claim to fame was the Akbar letters. And all of a sudden, right at this period of time, you stop seeing that. You stop hearing that being the claim to fame, and the blessings go from being related to the letters to being related to this mysterious cloth that has the image on it. Okay, and that's something we do have historical basis for. They start talking about the image of Edessa quite a bit. And they talk about how it was this unusual cloth that would always be displayed in landscape format. So rectangle on its side as opposed to portrait, rectangle on its short side. And this folded cloth with the face image on it. So we keep hearing about this, and at this point now we're in historical reality. We have multiple accounts of this through different writers and historians talking about it at different periods of time. So we've moved from what we can only say is pure legend into the historical fact. And strangely enough, from this point forward, when the image was rediscovered, the imagery that was made of Jesus in artwork also changed, okay, around the world, starting from Edessa, but spreading throughout the world. Jesus was starting to be depicted differently. So up until this time, Jesus was portrayed sort of like a Roman, with a rounded face and kind of looked Roman. But yet, once the image of Edessa was rediscovered following the flood, what we find is the image looks very much like the image we see today. And these images are amazingly consistent. And by the way, they're consistent with the image that appears on the shroud today. All right. And we call these consistencies the Vignon markings, named after the gentleman that discovered this. But there's 15 specific points in this image that appears on the shroud that all of a sudden, from this point forward, from the mid-6th century on, start to appear in every image created of Jesus Christ. Coincidence? Who knows? All right? But for some reason, people now all of a sudden believed, wait a second, this is what Jesus looked like. And he's depicted, as you see, as a Middle Eastern man with fairly striking features. A longer face, a sharper nose, the eye sockets and brow structure of a Middle Eastern man, typical Middle Eastern man. And that started right at this point. So someone was convinced, wait a second, this is for real what Jesus looks like. And the question is, why were they convinced of that? So we then go fast forward to another almost 400 years. In the 7th century, Edessa does finally fall. So this great Christian city does fall, but it falls to the Islamic king. And at this time, Islam is really spreading. It starts its spread in the mid-600s, and by the mid-700s, almost 2/3 of the world has become Islamic. So this was at the very beginning, but it wasn't as if Islam was one group. In fact, that isn't one group today. It was multiple kings having Islamic beliefs that would fight each other more often than not for territory. But there was a fairly benevolent Islamic king that took control of Edessa. And benevolent in that he did not force everyone to convert to Islam. He was respectful of people's religious beliefs. And strangely enough, he fell into the position where he became the arbitrator of the image of Edessa, because you had these various Christian groups who were fighting over the image, and the king had to step in and say, stop this, okay, let's have some peace. And he took control of the image to prevent these various Christian groups from continuing to fight over it. Now, meanwhile, about 1,000 miles away, maybe not quite that much, in Constantinople, so on the very western rim of what is today modern Turkey, Edessa is in the southern rim of it. The Byzantine Empire was still thriving. It was still existing. It was holding off the Islamic attacks. And the Byzantine Empire was the remnants of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had split into the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire. The Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century to the Vandals and the other warring tribes. But the Eastern Roman Empire continued to exist under Byzantine rule in the East for several more centuries. And the emperor, the Roman emperor, that's what you called the Byzantine emperor, he was quite a collector of religious artifacts, and he had collected, pieces of the True Cross and pieces of what were believed to be the Crown of Thorns and other religious artifacts. And he gets wind of the image of Edessa and decides, hey, I think I'd like it. Okay. As a matter of fact, he actually had an interesting name for it, tetradiplon, which means a cloth folded in four. So he was referring to the image of Edessa as a large cloth that had been folded into 4 pieces to reveal this facial image, which, interestingly enough, if you see the shroud on the left, that's what it looks full length. If you cut it in, fold it in half, now you have one piece. That's step number 2. You fold it in half again, you have another piece, step number 3. You fold it in half again, another piece, step number 4. You fold it in half again, the 4th doubling, and now all of a sudden you have just the face visible, which if you look at it below it, it kind of matches what we see on these images of Edessa that are portrayed in art, that it would have been this very large cloth, if it had been folded 4 times over, would have revealed just the facial image. But anyway, the Byzantine Empire, he wanted this thing. So he goes to Edessa, he marches there with a very large army to make an offer to the Islamic king. The Islamic king still controlled Edessa at this point, and he makes an offer. And the offer is, here's this chest of gold, but if you don't take it, we're going to destroy your city. So it was really an offer that the king of Edessa had to agree to. It was an offer he could not refuse, all right? So it was actually silver, not gold. So the king was going to say, look, we're going to give you these 200 prisoners that we've taken from battles with your army. We're going to give you this quantity of silver, and we're not going to attack your city. Just give us the image of Edessa. The king, the Islamic king, does indeed agree. And that image is brought back to Constantinople, where it's renamed and called the Mandalion, okay? And that comes from the Arab words mandal, which means napkin, okay? And a display mechanism is actually created so that it can be unfurled. So they're now saying, yes, this was indeed a folded cloth, and we're going to unfurl it. Matter of fact, it was unfurled and shown as an object for veneration each weekend in the city of Constantinople. Excuse me. So again, you're seeing something here that was described by a man named Robert de Clary. So now we're moving up another couple of centuries. The mandolin has been formerly the image of Edessa, but now the mandolin has been in Constantinople for several centuries. Robert de Clary, he's a chronicler, a documenter of what was happening on the Fourth Crusade. This infamous crusade I mentioned earlier, where a Christian army on its way to liberate Jerusalem stops in Constantinople for supplies, sees how wealthy Constantinople is, and decides, let's take this city instead. So Christian army destroying a Christian city. And Robert de Clary was there, and he reported seeing the shroud, okay? And he reported rising out of this box, and he was very descriptive in the mechanism that that was created to let it rise out. So you can see how this would rise out of the box in its fourfold position, and then these rods would flip up, and the whole cloth would slowly be unfolded out of the box until you got to the point that you see on the left here, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, E, F, G anyway, where it's fully unfurled. So de Clary's description of this bizarre display mechanism were so good that we've been able to recreate it and realize that, wow, this actually would have worked for displaying the shroud. So de Clary describes that it was John Jackson, who was a NASA researcher out of Colorado Springs, Colorado, the Air Force, he actually uses the markings on the shroud. So some of the fold markings to reverse engineer this exact mechanism, and does indeed recreate it, and it does indeed work. So this is 700 years later, in the, more than 700 years later, in the 19th or the 20th century, that John Jackson does this and demonstrates that the markings that we now see on the shroud would indeed have been created by this folding mechanism, that this box that was described by this box that de Clary saw in Constantinople and described quite accurately in his writings. Well, what ends up happening was, again, Constantinople was sacked during the Fourth Crusade. Um, a lot of its treasures were saved, which means they were stolen and brought back to Europe, and they started showing up throughout Europe very quickly. As a matter of fact, the Pope, got freaked out by this, and actually said, "Hey, anyone who's caught with an artifact from Constantinople is going to be automatically excommunicated." This would have been, I think, Pope Innocent III. And the reason for that was he had promoted this crusade to go free the city of Jerusalem from Muslim control. And instead, what happens is they destroyed the second, or the greatest Christian city in the world, Constantinople, and stole all of its riches from the residents there. So again, it's sacked. These relics start showing up, and lo and behold, again, as Pope Innocent was anger, lo and behold, we start to hear about this mysterious new Templar initiation ceremony. So in the 13th and 14th centuries, the Templars had initiation ceremonies. So remember, the Templar Knights were knights that fought in multiple crusades, and they actually served for several centuries as the people that would help protect those that were going to Jerusalem along the way, prevent them from being attacked by robbers and thieves. So pilgrims going to Jerusalem would work with the Templars to be protected. And the Templars actually also protected their money. So what would happen is you would deposit the funds for your trip in a Templar account in Europe, and then the Templars would travel with you to protect you along the way. And then when you got to Jerusalem, you would get your money back from a Templar account in Jerusalem. It was actually one of the first banking systems that was controlled by the Templars. So we read about now, we've come back from Constantinople after the Fourth Crusade, and all of a sudden there's this new initiation ceremony of the Templars, where the face of God and the image of a crucified man is described being used. You'd have to venerate this as part of your initiation ceremony. And strangely enough, who happens to be the Templar master of the area of France known as Normandy, but Geoffrey de Charnay, the same Geoffrey de Charnay that built the church where his daughter Marguerite, his granddaughter, Marguerite, first put the shroud on display in the mid-14th century. And if you know anything about Templar history, the King of France in the early 14th century was in very dire straits, needed money to continue fighting his war against England, the ongoing English-French wars, and realized that the Templars, who were all over France and had this tremendous banking institution, were actually a tremendous source of wealth. So there were some charges trumped up against the Templars. And in a very bloody 2-week period of time, literally all of the Templars throughout France were wiped out and their money confiscated by the king and put to good use to prosecute his war in England, or at least what he thought was good use. And Geoffrey de Charnay was the Templar master. He was one of the people that was burned at the stake in 1314. And then it was just several decades later that his granddaughter finally puts the shroud on display. So we've now tracked the shroud from the city of Jerusalem to Edessa to Constantinople. And then how did it get from Constantinople back into Europe? And we now believe that it was the Templars, as part of the sack of Constantinople. They removed artifacts that, for example, de Clary, a Templar, had chronicled. And we believe the shroud was indeed one of those artifacts. And that brings us to 1355. That's when the de Charnay family puts it on display. And you ask, why are they finally doing this? Well, it was a money-making opportunity. This was a period of time, the medieval period, high medieval period, where Religious relics were highly venerated and sought after, and people would often make pilgrimages even to beautiful basilicas and cathedrals, much less places that held incredible relics. And so, this was, a way of saying, hey, we can support our little church here and make some money. And matter of fact, they even did something that a lot of people associate with Disney today, but Disney was not the inventor of this. Little badges were created by the Descharnay family, which would commemorate that you actually went to this pilgrimage site and saw the shroud. And if you look at the badge on the right, this would be a little piece of cloth that you would show on or sew onto your jacket. And people got into the habit of collecting them. They'd go to different religious sites and collect these little cloth badges and sew them on. And it would be very much like people do today when they go to Disney and have the little pins all over the place. So again, Disney is copying a little bit of Christian history here. But that is a very, good image of what one of those badges would look like. And if you look at the top third of it, or really the top half, you notice you see the man displayed head to head as he appears on the Shroud of Turin. And by the way, what you're seeing underneath that is the coat of arms of the Charnay family, and you're seeing some other religious symbolism here. So again, this was displayed as the burial cloth of Jesus. Became a very influential relic site. Which caused a problem because the local bishop actually had a beautiful cathedral, and one of his sources of income were pilgrims coming to see his cathedral. But now, all of a sudden, in this area, instead of coming to see his cathedral, they were all going to this small church to see the shroud. So it became actually a fight between the local bishop and the Descharnay family, where the local bishop said, well, this has to be a forgery. This can't be real. Don't go there. Don't buy into it. And ultimately, it caused quite a bit of a problem for Marguerite de Charnay, or Marguerite de Charnay. And eventually, the Savoy family, the royal family, one of the leading royal families, but ultimately the first true royal family of France. They were the first ones to consolidate control of what is today most of modern day France. They actually came in and acquired the shroud from Margaret. They bought it from her because they actually were believers in its authenticity, much to the chagrin of the bishop, and they had been promoting people to go to it, and they decided they were going to protect it. So they purchased it from Margaret, who clearly needed the money. And they actually never parted with it for multiple centuries. So the Savoy family, whenever they traveled, and as a royal family, they traveled quite a bit. One of the things that went with them, no matter where they went, was the shroud. So they kept it with them at all places and would often put it on display wherever they happened to be residing. And that lasted for half a century before they finally said, okay, we better not do much more damage to this thing by dragging it around the world. They did actually end up putting it on more permanent display in the royal chapel that appears in Chambéry Castle. And it stayed there for quite some time. And there is the chapel, so as part of the castle. So that is where it resided for quite some time. Strangely enough, this is one of the other bizarrenesses about the shroud. Just a couple of decades later, a pretty devastating fire broke out in this chapel, and they had stored the shroud in a reliquary. So you put relics in a reliquary. This was a large reliquary, basically a large ornate silver box. And when the fire broke out, most of the silver started to melt. Now inside it was more lead, but the silver dripped through the lead, and you got burn marks on the shroud that correlate to that fire from that chapel in 1532. As a matter of fact, you see some fairly major burn marks on the shroud today that correlate to that. And they were so bad that the Poor Clare nuns were asked to do some repair work. So in 1534, 2 years after the fire, they pulled the shroud out and said, okay, we got some big holes here. Let's do some things. And they did a couple of things. They kind of fixed those holes by putting patches on the cloth, and they're very rudimentary patches. So, this is ideally not how you would treat a relic or a major artwork or an artifact from antiquity, but that's what they did. And they also did something relatively smart. They sewed a backing on the back of the cloth, because every time the cloth was displayed, you'd be holding it by its edges, and you got to imagine at this point, this is a 1,500-year-old cloth. It was slowly and surely losing its strength and starting to tear. So they sewed a backing on it so that it would be stronger, so it could still be displayed, and then patch those distinctive burn marks. And then again, the shroud was in the chapel for another few decades. When it was moved to Turin, Italy, and this was where it actually resides to this day at the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. And it was theoretically moved to actually make it easy for Cardinal Charles Borromeo, very famous player in church history, especially through the Council of Trent, and the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catechism from the 16th century. But they said, well, the reason we're moving it to Turin, Italy is so that Charles Borromeo can easily visit it. So he doesn't have to cross over the mountains, the Alps, into France to see it. But the reality is what was happening was the Savoy family realized that their rule in France was coming to an end. And slowly but surely, they started exporting all of their riches and artworks to Italy, to various places, so that they could preserve them for their family, knowing that at some point they would be deposed. And that's probably the real reason why it ended up in Turin. It wasn't to save Charles Borromeo, a trip over the Alps. But that's where it remained. And the image you see in the lower right is how it was displayed. So you could literally just walk right up to it and touch it if you wanted. It was, in a frame, but exposed, under glass, but, exposed to the elements, exposed to the air, and something you could get very close to, right? The only time it's left, this particular chapel, was during World War II. This particular area of Italy was being bombed pretty heavily, so they did move it to an undisclosed location in southern Italy for a period of about 3 years during World War II. But as soon as the war ended, it was moved back to that cathedral. And over the course of that whole time, from 1578 to really almost 1900, it was shown pretty regularly. So they'd bring it out in front of the cathedral, and people would make pilgrimages to it. Matter of fact, if you were anyone or powerful in Europe, you would go see the shroud. That was something you had to, check off on your list that all of the elites do. So multiple kings and popes and bishops and political leaders and military leaders chronicled their visit to Turin to actually see the shroud. And you can see it would normally be displayed, as you see in this image here, from an elevated platform with multiple people holding the top and the edges, which, as you can imagine, it being exposed to the elements and being held by the edges, even with that backing that the Poor Clare nuns put on it, probably put a lot of stress on the cloth itself. And over the years, those edges got pretty tattered. It needed to be repaired multiple times, something that we also have documented pretty well from the caretakers. So we're almost up to the 20th century at this point in shroud history. And, a very pivotal moment occurs here in 1898. That's why I stopped there on the previous slide, when this amateur photographer, Secondo Pia, and he was an amateur, but everyone was at that point. The idea of professional photography hadn't really evolved. So he was dabbling in this new science for several years, and he convinced the Savoy family, hey, the shroud's getting pretty beat up. Maybe what we ought to do is take some pictures of it, just so that we always have a record of what it looks like. Pretty interesting idea. So take a picture of an artifact, make sure that you preserve it for posterity, because again, this thing theoretically will not last forever, at least with the technology they had at the time, at the turn of the century. And Secunda, being an amateur, made a mistake. So as at that point, you had cameras that use photo negative plates. The plates would have to be processed. And unfortunately, what he did is he let the processing go too long. And when you do that, you get what's called a photo negative image. And that is how we got this first image, that very high contrasting image that really brought out the detail of the human body that's depicted on the shroud. It was accidental, okay? It's also what made people realize that, wait a second. The reason it's coming out so clear as a photo negative is that the image itself is a photo negative. So another interesting twist was discovered. This wasn't just any type of image. it itself is a photonegative, which means somehow light was involved in its creation. So, people then got really excited. They're like, okay, we got to figure out what this thing is and how this got created. And probably one of the first to really study it in detail was this gentleman, Yves Delage. He was actually the head of the French Academy of Science at the time, but he was also a medical doctor. And he spent a great deal of time studying now these images that the photographer had created of the shroud. And he came out and he said, hey, wait a second. I've studied this. This is so medically accurate, okay, that there's no way this could have been created as a forgery. This isn't a piece of artwork. This is an actual depiction of someone who was tortured and died in a very, very specific way. And he actually gave a speech to the French Academy of Science in the early 1900s saying, I believe this is authentic. Which didn't work out so well for him. So, early 1900s, not a great time to be validating a religious artifact in France. The Enlightenment had pretty much destroyed most of Christian faith in France, and scientism was ruling the day. So here is the leading scientist of the leading Academy of Science, the French Academy of Science, coming out and starting to make some claims that, hey, I think this is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Did not go over well. Yves was removed from that office and kicked out of the academy, which is typical of what happens in these kind of situations. But again, his findings have been confirmed over and over again by medical science and medical pathologists, even to this day. They're like, yes, everything he did that chronicled the damage to the body was 100% accurate. We agree with his findings. This is the image of a brutally beaten, tortured, scourged, crown of thorns, crucified man. And it is exactly what we would expect to see if such an image was created. We go forward. We're getting close to the end of part one. We'll take a little break shortly, so just hang in there. We're up in 1972. The shroud has now, really had an interesting history through the 20th century. People go to venerate it quite a bit in the city of Turin. It's a big piece of tourism and the underlying element of tourism for that city. But you certainly had some people that did not want this thing to exist. So in 1972, it was bombed. Someone tried to destroy it, which really got even more attention. It had an interesting effect. The bombing did not work. It did not get damaged. But the fire did do some damage to some of the holders and the church itself, but fairly easily repairable. But this brought the shroud back into the news media. People started talking about the shroud again. And that's when something very unusual happened. In 1973, in Colorado Springs, Colorado, a group of NASA scientists, they said, well, just for fun, let's take the pictures that this guy took. And these were pictures taken, we're talking about 80 years earlier now by Pia Segunda. And let's put them through this cool device we have called the VP8 image analyzer. So this was the device that they were using in the early 70s to take the two-dimensional images that the Apollo astronauts had taken of the moon's surface. And this device could take a two-dimensional image, and if it was a two-dimensional image of a three-dimensional object, could actually create a three-dimensional image of it. And they said, let's see what happens when we throw the shroud pictures through this. And they fully expected nothing to happen. They said, well, the shroud is clearly a two-dimensional image of a two-dimensional image, okay? It's a picture of a picture. But lo and behold, when they put it through the VP8 image analyzer, what comes out but a 3D image? So they realized, wait a second, this image on the shroud is not a two-dimensional image. It is actually a three-dimensional image. It has layers to it. And you can actually bring that three-dimensional image out. What you're seeing on the left is the first image that the VP8 image analyzer produced, which gives you a pretty detailed view of the face of the man on the shroud, okay? And this astonished scientists because they're thinking, wait a second, how did somebody create a 3D image 2,000 years ago? And how did they do this on a linen cloth made of flax? All right, so now all of a sudden you have a whole different level of interest, okay? Now people are finally lit on fire saying there's something we have to do. This resulted in what's called the Shroud of Turin Research Project, so STURP for short. 1978, this whole team of scientists, and it was a very well-organized team, um, go and they study the shroud, and we're going to get more into the detail in part two, and they declare it's authentic. Okay, so they spent some time studying it. These were scientists from various technical backgrounds, primarily from the United States, but a couple from Europe as well, from a fairly diverse religious background. So you had Christians and Jews and Muslims and atheists, but they come out and said, "Hey, this is the real deal. We've tested this thing." And strangely enough, they took their time chronicling their findings. So as typical, scientists do not rush through this kind of thing. So they, after their studies, they came back and verified their data and, wrote up a scientific paper, and they wanted to present the paper to the Pope before they released it to the news media. And they were actually at the Vatican. This is, bizarre twist of fate, on May 13th, 1981, to do that very thing. They had an audience with the Pope where they were going to present the results of their study with the shroud. And strangely enough, you know anything about our history, that is the same day that why John Paul II was out in front of the Vatican saying hello to pilgrims, that the Turkish gunman, Mehmet Adakka, actually tried to kill the Pope. So the very day that the shroud researchers were there to present their findings and declare the shroud authentic, there was the assassination attempt on the Pope. So they never actually got to deliver that data to John Paul II, as he was nearly killed that very same day. And obviously they released the findings of the study. It appeared in multiple magazines, Nature, Time magazine. Nature at the time was where you'd release any scientific study. And the shroud got all sorts of fanfare, and again, Turin was swamped by people coming to see the shroud. And the Savoy family at this point was dying out. They still owned the shroud, and they did an interesting thing in 1983. They actually said, you know what, we shouldn't be the owners. The Pope should own it. So in 1983, they bequeathed it to the Pope, and not the specific Pope. Okay. So this John Paul II would have been the Pope at the time, but they said this actually is going to be owned by whoever the Pope is at any given moment. So, for example, right now, Pope Francis owns the shroud. He is the actual owner, and only he can determine what happens to it. So that last surviving member of the Savoy family did that as a gesture before his death, and the popes have owned it ever since. So for the last 41 years, the popes have owned it. And then not much happened until 1988. So in 1988, science had really advanced quite a bit. And we had this technology that was really setting the world on fire, called carbon-14 testing. And it was being used to age all sorts of ancient artifacts, finding some were fakes and some were real. And, people got pretty excited about carbon-14 testing. And they convinced the church authorities, hey, we should test the shroud. And they said, yeah, let's do that, because every other test we've run have confirmed it. It's a first century cloth. We believe it's authentic, blah, blah, blah. Well, lo and behold, they test the shroud, and all hell breaks loose. Okay, no pun intended. Because the scientists come out from the British Museum, who were the managers of the test. So they come out and said the shroud's a fake, that we believe that carbon-14 dating of the material in the shroud tells us that it is not from the first century, that everything the Sturp team had done was wrong, and that it's actually a 13th or 14th century cloth, and hence could not possibly be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Huge crushing blow. Front page news on every newspaper on the planet. Cover of Time magazine, the shroud's a fake, the shroud's a fake. This picture in the lower right became quite famous, as did the three gentlemen in this picture. We're going to talk a little bit about them. And it was a disaster. Now, we're going to break here, but before we break, I do want to give you a spoiler alert, all right? Because you know how I started this presentation. So at this point, you're like, wait a second. Carbon-14 dating just proved that this was a fake, that this cloth could not have originated from the first century. And what I'm going to tell you is that the carbon-14 dating test that they performed actually proved nothing. Okay. And in the part two, we're going to kind of go through, we're going to go now walk through detail in part two of all the scientific testing done by both the STIRP group and the folks at Carbon-14. Then we're going to talk about the testing that's been done since and some of the interesting findings that have been discovered about the Carbon-14 testing and some of the things that went on there that weren't actually reported at the time of the test. And you're going to end up getting involved in an international scandal that involves the British Museum. And so it's the stuff right out of movies, okay? Conspiracy theories left and right. But what I'm going to tell you right now is that we now know that the Carbon-14 dating actually proved absolutely nothing. So at that point, with that spoiler alert given there to you, we're going to take a little break. I encourage you to take a break. And I would, take a couple of days, mull over everything we've covered so far. Maybe you want to go back and watch elements of this again to see that history, the undisputed facts, that relation to the Gospels, and just let that sink in. Because in part two, we're going to go now into another layer and really bring you up until, what's the latest and greatest news here in the year 2024. So I hope you join me for part two again, and I hope you're enjoying this so far. See you at part two.